Episode 48, Perform Independent Verification and Validation for Assurance, we focus on gaining credible assurance by bringing in independent eyes, methods, and evidence-driven reviews. Independent verification and validation, often shortened to IV&V, is about more than hiring a different team to repeat the same steps. It is about creating a structured, objective challenge to the story the project is telling about its own security. For an exam candidate, this is where governance, engineering practice, and assessment discipline converge. The core idea is simple. The closer a team is to a system, the easier it becomes to overlook assumptions and skip uncomfortable questions. Independent review restores balance by examining both controls and evidence from a fresh vantage point and documenting the results in a way that stands up to scrutiny. The first building block of meaningful IV&V is separation of teams and incentives. Independence is not just organizational distance. It includes reporting lines, performance objectives, and the absence of pressure to defend prior design choices. In practice, that can mean a central assurance or internal audit function that does not report into the delivery chain it is reviewing, or an external partner with clearly defined responsibilities and no stake in passing or failing a particular release. Transparency is equally important, with engagement terms, access levels, and communication patterns documented and agreed in advance. When participants understand that reports will be read by management, auditors, and sometimes customers, accountability becomes explicit rather than assumed. Once independence is established, coverage becomes the next priority. IV&V activities should verify that requirements, control objectives, and risk treatments are actually reflected in tests and evidence, not just in design documents. This involves tracing from documented requirements through acceptance criteria to specific test cases, logs, and configuration snapshots. Coverage analysis often exposes areas where requirements were interpreted too narrowly or where testing focused only on happy paths. That discovery is not a failure. It is the value of independent review. Validation then examines whether implementations meet intent under realistic operating conditions, not just in ideal lab scenarios. Independent reviewers look at how systems behave when loads spike, when dependencies degrade, and when error conditions cascade. They might review stress testing artifacts, fault injection results, or high availability failover exercises, and compare them with stated availability and integrity requirements. Assurance comes from seeing that security controls hold up when the environment is noisy and imperfect, such as under peak transaction volume or partial service outages. When IV&V uncovers controls that work only in quiet conditions, it highlights gaps that matter most in real incidents. Recreating tests independently is another hallmark of strong IV&V work. This is not done to second-guess every decision, but to confirm reproducibility, environment parity, and tool chain integrity. Independent testers may set up their own instances of scanning tools, use separate accounts in staging environments, or reconstruct manual steps based on procedures and runbooks. If results diverge significantly, the team investigates whether configuration differences, data variations, or undocumented workarounds are responsible. The goal is to ensure that reported results are not fragile artifacts of one particular tester's environment, but outcomes that can be reproduced and relied on by others. Documentation is treated as an object of evaluation rather than a mere accessory. Independent reviewers assess whether documents are complete enough to support ongoing operation, incident response, and future change, and whether they trace cleanly from requirements to implementation and evidence. They compare what is written with observed system behavior, including interface responses, log content, and configuration states. Inconsistencies, such as procedures that reference obsolete components or data flows that no longer match diagrams, are recorded as findings in their own right. This focus recognizes that documentation is part of the control environment, not just an administrative artifact. Challenging assumptions is a critical and sometimes uncomfortable part of independent work. IV&V engagements often revisit threat models, risk registers, and compensating control arguments to see whether they still hold up under a more adversarial lens. Red team perspectives play a role here, not necessarily through full-scale adversary simulations, but by asking how a determined attacker or insider would view the architecture and controls. Assumptions about trust zones, privileged roles, or unlikely attack paths are surfaced and examined against current technology and threat intelligence. The intent is not to undermine teams, but to make risk reasoning more explicit and robust. Suppliers and inherited controls also fall under IV&V scrutiny. Many modern architectures rely on cloud platforms, managed services, and third-party software components whose security posture is described through attestations, certifications, and contractual commitments. An independent review evaluates whether those artifacts are sufficient for the risks involved and where they leave gaps that must be addressed by local controls. That can include examining system and organization controls, SOC reports, cloud shared responsibility matrices, and vendor hardening guides against actual deployment patterns. When reliance on inherited controls exceeds what the evidence justifies, IV&V calls that out so that risk acceptance is conscious rather than accidental. Configuration, deployment, and secrets management practices provide another concrete focus for independent sampling. Reviewers may select representative systems, environments, or services and test them against documented baselines, security standards, and hardening guides. They look at how encryption keys, passwords, tokens, and certificates are stored, rotated, and audited, and whether these practices match both policy and vendor recommendations. Sampling also touches on continuous integration and deployment pipelines, checking how configuration changes are introduced, tested, and rolled out. These spot checks build a picture of whether secure configurations are the norm or the exception. When findings are compiled, they must be presented in a way that balances technical depth with stakeholder usability. Each finding should carry a clear severity rating, backed by rationale that explains impact, likelihood, and relevant regulatory or contractual implications. Recommendations should be framed as actionable steps or strategic options rather than vague calls to improve security. Independent teams often group related findings to highlight systemic issues, such as recurring access control weaknesses or inconsistent logging. The final package should be something that product owners, risk managers, and executives can use to prioritize effort without needing to decode specialist language. Verification does not stop with the initial report. Confirming corrective actions is part of the assurance cycle. IV&V teams review remediation plans, examine evidence of implemented changes, and retest where appropriate to see that fixes behave as intended. They pay particular attention to whether root causes were addressed or only superficial symptoms removed, which often involves looking at patterns across multiple related findings. When retests succeed, assurance statements are updated to reflect the new posture, often with explicit notes about which risk categories have been mitigated and which remain. This iterative loop turns static reports into evolving narratives of improvement. At the end of an engagement, independent reviewers typically provide an attestation summary tailored to audiences such as customers, auditors, and leadership. This summary does not expose sensitive technical details, but it describes scope, methods, and the overall level of assurance in clear, non-misleading terms. It may highlight strengths as well as significant residual risks, explaining how the organization plans to manage those risks going forward. For practitioners, being able to read and interpret such attestations is as important as helping draft them, because they influence how external parties perceive control effectiveness. A well-crafted summary becomes a reusable artifact in customer due diligence and audit conversations. A short mental review of this episode's themes shows how they fit together into a coherent IV&V practice. Independence ensures that reviews are not captive to delivery pressures, while coverage, reproducibility, and documentation checks make sure the story about controls is anchored in evidence. Supplier evaluations and configuration sampling extend the lens beyond custom code to the full ecosystem, and disciplined reporting and remediation tracking turn findings into sustained change. Attestation closes the loop by communicating results externally in language aligned with risk and responsibility. Together, these elements define a mature approach to independent assurance rather than a one-time second opinion. The practical conclusion for episode 48 is that independent verification and validation becomes real only when time and scope are explicitly set aside for it. Scheduling an IV&V window for a meaningful system or release with a clear definition of objectives, boundaries, and artifacts to be reviewed is a strong first step. When teams commit to this structure and follow through on findings, independent review evolves from a checkbox into a trusted part of the organization's assurance fabric. For an exam candidate, understanding and advocating for this kind of structured independence is a hallmark of professional maturity. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.